All right, so we are beginning the live cast. Now we have to see if we actually go live. Usually I'll start seeing people come in line. The challenge has been this Substack integration. And so anyway, we'll get started. If it turns out it's not working, we'll have to redo it. It'll take a couple minutes. So, hey, everyone, we're back for another of the sporadic episodes of Sinocism Live. Today we have a great, we are live. I just got the email, so we should be live. So people should start filtering in. We have a terrific guest, Joseph Torigian, who is a professor at American University. And he is on sabbatical right now, and he has written really, I think, the most influential and important China book this year about Xi Jinping's father, Xi Zhongxun, called "The Party's Interests Come First: The Life of Xi Zhongxun, Father of Xi Jinping." And today, his book came out several months ago, and you may have heard him on his other podcasts. He's really, I think, again, this is the most publicized China history book I think I've ever seen, which is terrific, and congratulations for that. But today we really I want to hear from Joseph and let about the book and how you wrote it and what you think is most interesting and important about it. But I also thought it was very topical too, given what has happened over the last few days with the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, or the end of the victory in the World Anti-Fascist War, and the Putin and Kim, and sort of some very I would say Cold War-esque imagery that we saw from the military hardware to the leaders at the in Beijing. So if that makes sense, why don't we go ahead and get started? And if you would just go ahead and get a quick intro about yourself and the book, and we'll get the conversation going.
Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me, Bill. I'm glad that I did this with you because now I know it's pronounced Sinocism and not Sinocism. So I'll have to be more accurate in the future, but it's absolutely essential. So thanks so much for doing it every day, sometimes even on the holidays. So I'm a professor at American University. I know, Bill, you're a neighbor, so you know it very well.
Yes, and just a few blocks away.
I, like many other people, have a China book this year. It's really been quite an extraordinary few months in terms of lots of terrific books coming out, from Eva Dou's book on Huawei to Dan Wang's new book on America and China and engineers and lawyers. And so I'm really happy to chat with you about mine today. It's a biography of Xi Jinping's father, Xi Zhongxun. And I wrote it for two reasons. One is I thought that showing what kind of milieu Xi Jinping grew up as a part of, what it was like for him to be in a revolutionary family, but also more broadly to tell a story of the Chinese Communist Party in the 20th century through this remarkable figure who I think deserves attention, not just because he's the father of Xi Jinping, but because he tells us so much about elite politics, ideology, the United Front, global communism, and speaks to this puzzle of why both father and son have remained loyal to this organization that is both so emotionally and organizationally powerful, but at the same time has brought a lot of suffering, not only to the family, but throughout China as well.
No, that is what's fascinating, is because Xi Zhongxun really, and you talk about it in your book, it's sort of party's interests come first, is in spite of all the personal suffering that was inflicted upon Xi Zhongxun and his family multiple times. Again, you would think Xi Jinping might have a different idea, but in fact, it's almost like he's doubled down and says, I'll do it, but I'm going to do it right. And I'm going to do it as I'm going to run things. I'm going to make sure that, right, because a lot of it is I'm going to make sure that I am in control of history. I'm in control of who gets purged, as opposed to being the purger, not the purgee in some ways.
Absolutely. I think that appreciating why demands a sensitivity to this Bolshevik political culture where suffering is something that you take pride in because it forges you. It both reveals your dedication, but also makes it stronger because you want to prove yourself even more, right? So if the party is the wellspring of meaning in your life and it rejects you, the answer is to prove to the party that you're just as good as anyone else and even better. And so for Xi Jinping, growing up in that kind of family, he would have witnessed his father's thinking in this way, but perhaps Xi Jinping himself was reflecting about how he also would like to prove that the Xi family is loyal to the revolution. And I think he believes he's saving it, essentially.
No, I mean, that is the question, right? Is, I think from an American perspective, you think, wow, these folks, they should be disillusioned because of this suffering. But in reality, if you look at, I mean, I think you look at like Xi Jinping and the arc of his life, when he was a kid, China was poor, China was backwards, but then you look at the evolution through the end of the Mao era, end of the Cultural Revolution, to the Deng era. In some ways, how would you question the actual correctness of what the general direction of the party is? And in some ways, I think that culminates in large regard in what we just saw this week, where China is, looks like they're reshaping the world order. Looks like they have, a military that may be on close or near parity with the U.S. I mean, in some ways, it's all worth it, right?
You know what? I was going to use those exact words before you used them at the end of your question, which was the bet that Xi Jinping made that no matter the mistakes that the party has committed, no matter what he went through, he stayed with it. And look where China is now. Look at the parade that they just had. And so for him, it's a utilitarian calculation, this idea that because China faces enemies at home and abroad, you need to structure society in a way that demands idealism, that demands discipline, that uses history as moral education to inoculate younger generations against what he sees as this threat of the imperialists who plot peaceful evolution, right? Because they're too afraid to use force to destroy communism. So what they do is try to win over younger people so that once they come to power, in Xi's mind, people like Gorbachev, then they dismantle it on their own so that Americans don't have to sacrifice their lives and their money to do that. But I want to add something else, Bill, which is some people did feel disillusioned because of what they went through during the Cultural Revolution, right? And that disillusionment meant different things. So as I write about in my book, some people, including princelings, decided that after that kind of horrific experience, they wanted to make up for lost time. They wanted to have fun. They wanted to make money. They wanted to date. They wanted to go overseas. Some of them started to do avant-garde art, which for Xi Jinping is a manifestation of peaceful evolution, right? Because it's art that doesn't look like
bourgeoisie tendencies,
liberalism,
or
and some
spiritual
people
pollution.
Exactly. And some people wanted constitutionalism and rule of law. And their answer to the Cultural Revolution was that you need to have a restricted party and a restricted leader. Otherwise, people are going to face those kinds of disasters. And Xi Jinping, who said in the 1980s repeatedly that he dedicated his life to prevent another Cultural Revolution from happening. So for him, it was the danger of not enough state power as opposed to too much, which is an interesting reaction to that history. Not the only reaction.
No, it is. And it is also, again, why did the Xi Jinping view win out, right? Is the big question is how did, how was he able to be the princeling that, because his dad was important, but he wasn't, his dad was senior, but not that senior. And so how was it that Xi Jinping rose to the position he's in compared to these other more senior princeling family members?
Yeah, two things to say about that. One is, I don't think people were really sure what Xi Jinping thought before he became the top leader. It was a little ambiguous. And so for people on the outside who talk about how American journalists or intel or scholars were surprised by Xi Jinping, well, people in the system were surprised too. And one of the reasons that they were surprised was because of their understanding of his father, who, as you said, he was at the top, but not the very top. I think the bottom of the top would be a good way to describe him. But because he had such a sterling reputation, I've seen accounts that helped Xi Jinping's case. I've seen accounts that suggested, well, if it's a princeling, at the very least, he won't be the one to bury the revolution. But I think it's also useful to keep in mind that being a princeling was a double-edged sword for him throughout his entire life, right? Where sometimes being the son of Zhongxun was not good, especially during the Cultural Revolution, right? When he kept trying to get into the party but was rejected. And then he got certain very cushy jobs because of his father, but he also faced this broad societal antipathy to princelings, who thought that they were benefiting in ways that were inappropriate. And that continued into the 90s and the 2000s. And so Xi Jinping, he says, well, yeah, of course, being the son of Xi Zhongxun mattered, but not in the ways that people think. Actually, I suffered more than most. And this gets back to what we were saying before, which is he says that because he was facing family persecution earlier than other families, right? Because his father fell in 1962, not 1966. And in fact, the Xi family was famous even within party circles for being disciplinarian and frugal.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's not completely being truthful when he says it, but there is some accuracy, right? When he says that it was harder for him in some ways being the son of his father. And, he said that he saw the fickleness of human nature, right? He didn't see the parades, he saw through it. And so you have this very curious mix of idealism and conviction, but also political realism in Xi Jinping.
No, it's so let's talk just how did you write this book? I'm fascinated because I mean, again, the research is just voluminous, and I mean, how and were you able to access things when you started this work that you now wouldn't because of sort of increasing controls over access to information?
So I think that a book about the writing of the book would be longer than the book itself. It certainly was a very challenging project, and for reasons that also speak to the themes that have already appeared in our conversation, which is that for Xi Jinping, negative portrayals of the past are existential for regime security, literally. And so these senior leaders who I just mentioned to you, who thought Xi Jinping would be different from what he's turned out to be, the first warning sign was in his remarks on the collapse of the Soviet Union. And one of the things he said was that they lost control of their history. And that's why the Soviet Union collapsed.
And what year did he make those remarks?
2012.
2012. Okay. So yeah. Was he already, he'd already become general secretary?
He was already the leader. Right. Okay. Right. But not the president yet, I believe.
Right, but president doesn't matter. Yeah,
exactly, exactly. Yeah, but also it's just hard to study these regimes because even in the regimes, people don't know what the heck is going on half the time, right? So one of the things I keep saying over and over again is that even people in the Politburo Standing Committee didn't know what other people in the Politburo Standing Committee thought, right? And so when you read, one of the most important sources for my book are these diaries at the Hoover Institution that were written by Lee Ray, who was a secretary to Mao, worked in the organization department during the 1980s, but was also the doyen of this circle of pro-reform senior revolutionaries and intellectuals in Beijing that coalesced around this magazine called Yanhuang Chunxiu. And so he has all these rumors in those diaries that I know are wrong.
I have the last two issues of it being a real magazine on my desk. I was a subscriber in Beijing. These are the last two before it was completely neutered by Xi, which is a different topic.
Those are treasures.
They are treasures. By the way, they are treasures.
His father, by the way, wrote an inscription for Yanhuang Chunxiu called it was like "ban de bu cuo," right? But that inscription,
Well, one aside. I didn't mean to interrupt you. One aside. We'll get back to it. The thing is you could sort of tell who the audience was because the ads in the actual physical newspaper, printed Yanhuang Chunqiu newspapers, they're for Zhu Tingqi for hearing aids.
Well, when I read the Lee Ray diaries, I learned a lot about what I can look forward to when I get older because he talks about all of his physical ailments and how he slept, how many times he went to the bathroom, that kind of thing. So, right. But
sorry, I cut you off. Yeah.
Now, we're not going to have to worry about aging because we have these new technologies that Xi and Putin were talking about during the parade. But anyways, so, people talk about how hard it is to do party history, and it ain't easy. For the reasons I just described, but if you're sensitive to possibilities and not limitations, it's exhausting to even think about how much you can do, right? And one of the reasons it's exhausting is you have to eat a lot of sawdust, right? So this is, of course, that expression, the old China hand expression that you need to eat a lot to get any protein at all. So I would say like a huge percentage of what I read was totally useless. But, what did I find? Well, I'll start with the most interesting, which is that there's a lot of internally circulated material, archives, memoirs that have become available at American libraries, right? by one way or another. So if you go to Princeton, which has a full collection, University of Michigan has a pretty complete collection of what's colloquially known as the LA set, the 中共重要历史文件汇编. And there's incredible stuff. And then you also have Song Young-Yi's Cultural Revolution database. And you have the Lee Ray diaries, as I described to you. And so those can be considered primary sources, right? Along with document collections published in Hong Kong. And not only just that kind of material, but lots of memoirs outside of mainland censorship.
And are the Hong Kong documents still available freely?
So the books that were published by Hong Kong presses, they're available, right?
Okay.
The documents that were like at the, what's it called? The Hong Kong Services Center, Research Center. I can't remember the exact name.
That's what it's called.
Some of those documents are available at other institutions. So most of that, I think, would still be accessible. And we can talk about specific examples. And so, and then also I made a list of every time Xi Jinping's father went to another country or representatives or another country went to China. And I got those materials. So Italian Communist Party, the Yugoslav archives, the French Communist Party archives, the Soviet archives. I was able to acquire the transcripts of the conversations between the Dalai Lama's emissaries and Xi Zhongxun. And I interviewed the Dalai Lama. So anybody who met with him, I tried to meet as well. I also used a lot of newspapers. So sometimes just making a chronology is very powerful, right? And I also want to assert that the period before Xi came to power, the stuff that was getting published in the mainland was quite extraordinary, right? Not just Yanhuang Chuanqiu, but a lot of other journals, but also the chronologies, the official chronologies, the official biographies, these official document collections, like they're a part of the mosaic you're putting together, right? Especially because they tend to make errors of omission rather than commission, right? So sometimes they change the language or sometimes they just remove something entirely. But at the very least, they can sensitize you to possibilities. And when you have the original source and you can compare, you can see what they really care about. But also, you can take stuff that they might understand why it's sensitive until you put it into context, right? So, for example, the Xi Zhongxun chronology that came out right before I needed to submit my manuscript, a lot of what was significant in there would have been totally invisible to me if I hadn't already been working on this project for so many years.
How many years was your project?
I think 8 or 9, maybe almost 10. So wow. A long time.
It's like a child.
I know, yeah, exactly.
No, it is an amazing work of scholarship, and I guess I have a question just because we sort of have a friend, we sort of kind of adjacent to some of this stuff. Can we talk a little bit about why Xi's dad was purged in 1962?
Absolutely.
And what you think really happened there?
Yeah, so it's such a central moment in his life, but also such a complicated one because there were so many different things going on. The simple answer is that he was blamed for writing a book. So what does that mean? Well, it requires some explanation of party history in the Northwest in the 1930s. You had all of this infighting. In fact, sometimes these party members killed each other. And
sometimes more than sometimes.
Yeah, so there were these two figures, Liu Zhidan and Xie Zichang, these two titans of the Northwest communist movement. And then they got along sometimes, but not always. But more importantly, there were disputes about which one of them mattered more. And then in 1935, you had this inter-party purge, and Xi Zhongxun thought that he was going to be executed, although the evidence suggests that it probably wasn't as close as he later portrayed it. And then you had, in the 1940s, Mao Zedong's promotion of a man named Gao Gang as the representative of the Northwesterners as a whole. And not everybody liked that, especially this guy Yan Hongyan. And so Gao Gang is the first great purge of the People's Republic of China, 1952 and 53. And then this guy Yan Hongyan starts to activate, partly at the encouragement of Deng Xiaoping, wants to sort of reclaim some of the prestige and status that he thought Gao stole away from him. And so when this novel appears about Liu Zhidan, Yan Hongyan is furious because he thinks that it's
An
basically
attack
about
on
Gao.
him.
Yeah, exactly. And so he complains. He was encouraged to complain by Deng. And this, the response, right, is to trigger basically a collective attack on Xi Zhongxun by almost everybody else within the elite, right? So later, Xi Zhongxun would basically say it was all the fault of Kang Sheng, but it was really a lot of other people too, including Deng Xiaoping and Peng Zhen. But one last thing I have to say about this, which is, why did Mao react in the way that he did? And so in 1962, right, this is after the Great Leap Forward, and the party is recognizing the disaster and trying to figure out what to do about it. And they're not quite sure about how to talk about the catastrophe and how far to go to turn things around. And Mao is on board, right, with doing something to fix the situation. But then people go in a direction that he thinks is inappropriate. And he, because he's Mao, interprets this as a manifestation of class struggle. And then you have all these other people calling for rehabilitation, including Peng Dehuai, who is a close associate of Xi Zhongxun. And so this novel is interpreted by Mao as yet another sign of this class struggle problem. And we can talk about whether he actually thought that really was the case, or whether he needed to talk about it to show that it was a broader problem within the party, because the more problems you can identify and loop together as a political category, the more powerful it is. And so that's what happened to Xi Zhongxun. And of course, he was very skeptical about the novel. He didn't want to support it. But if the other Northwesterners persuaded him to.
Well, because it was the woman who wrote it was the sister-in-law of Liu Zhidan. Is that right?
And so people had the sexist view that she didn't understand the revolution because she was a woman and younger, and therefore Xi Zhongxun had to have written it because she couldn't.
And what she done, she had sent him, or she had sent him the manuscript, and he actually just tried to discourage her from publishing it or writing it. Correct?
There were multiple iterations, and initially he said, "Don't do this," or write short stories, and then he finally acceded to her, and then he coached her to say that you should be more careful in these particular ways. And so it just speaks, I think, to what we keep seeing in the news, which is, why do purges happen? Right. And even very careful people, even very cautious people, even people who know how dangerous it is to step out of line even the slightest bit, they can get caught up too, either because it is a legitimate, misstep, or because talking about it in that particular way by the leader is something that's useful to them. And if they think it's good for the party, and they'll do it. So
and so how old was Xi Jinping when his father was, effectively taken away in this purge related to this novel?
So Xi Jinping was born in June of 1953, and the purge of Xi Zhongxun was over the late summer and early fall of 1962. So about 9 years old.
And then, that 9 years old, his dad gets taken away, and then effectively, by the time the Cultural Revolution happens, he's 13 or so. I mean, you wonder, this goes back to, not to do sort of pop psychology, but, when you look at, because one of the things I heard when in the 17th Party Congress, when Xi Jinping was on the standing committee and he was the vice president, I think one of his, he was in charge of party history, I believe. And, what I heard was, people are afraid to talk to him because he knows party history better than the party historians, because he's so focused on the importance of party history. And I think we continue to see that right through his, since he became General Secretary in 2012, how much of that experience of his father being purged when he's 9 years old over this what would seem like kind of a just sort of a tangential historical question, how much of that seared into him this just thinking that controlling history is what matters, and controlling the narrative this is what it's all about.
So Xi Jinping really thinks that for the Communist Party to survive, you need to make people believe it, right? You need to inspire people, and that the organizational weapon is only an organizational weapon if you can charge people up. And to do that, you need to describe the party as a manifestation of a world historical force. That is the only way to bring China back to its rightful place in the world and achieve rejuvenation. If you talk about the party as one mistake after another, then that's not the kind of system that inspires faith and dedication. But I think party history for him also is dangerous, right? Because there were so many cases where people didn't get along with each other or people feuded with each other, was because of differences about how their past contributions should be characterized or how heavily their mistakes should be remembered, right? And so for him, I think that helps explain why he is a little bit more cautious, I think, on party history than people give him credit for. So let me give you an example. People say that he is skeptical about Deng's legacy. And we can talk about the relationship between Xi Zhongxun and Deng Xiaoping. That's another story.
Clearly very complicated.
Yeah, but I think that he's more careful than people give him credit for, right? And so what he says is, during the Cultural Revolution, we went too far. Too much class struggle, too much isolation. And then during Reform and Opening, which was unambiguously the right choice and imperative choice for the party at that time, bad tendencies appeared. Now, what's interesting is he doesn't blame anyone for that, right? It's sort of a passive voice situation, right? And so he says that he is acknowledging and resolving those problems that everyone else wanted to deal with but could not. And he also makes the case, Zhu Jiamu has made the case explicitly that even Deng Xiaoping never gave up the dagger of Mao Zedong thought, never gave up on struggle, never gave up on vigilance. And as I talk about in my book, that's true, right? You still had purges, you still had crackdowns, you still had campaigns under Deng, right? And so in that sense, he's talking about a new era, but he's talking about it in the sense of we're not rejecting our predecessors. We're loyal to them by adapting to the situation, which is a more loyal way of doing what they would have wanted to happen than just doing exactly what they had done in the past. And those are not my words. Those are explicitly his words in his very first article that he ever wrote for People's Daily in 1985.
And that feeds into this sort of the three eras, right? You had the Mao era, the Deng and the other guys era, and now we have the new era, which is the Xi era, right? So it seems like it's taking the good from the previous era and building upon it and expanding or
it's a middle path. It's a middle path, right? You take the benefits of the Mao era and you get rid of the bad stuff, and you take the benefits of the Deng era and you get rid of the bad stuff. And you see how that, in sense, that works in theory, right? Like, so you integrate the economy and security because you can't have one without the other. But in practice, it's really hard, right? Especially when the economy is slowing down and relations with the West are deteriorating. So,
well, moving to the present and history, what did you think of what happened of the celebrations around the 80th anniversary of the end of the war against resistance against Japanese aggression and the anti-fascist war?
So there were some things that weren't surprising and some things that I really took note of. What wasn't surprising is the use of World War II to summon another generation of Chinese to inherit the legacy of the people who fought in that war, right? To say that in the past, the enemy was defeated but not annihilated. Manifestations of fascism are still out there. In fact, when I read Sinocism this morning, I saw an article that essentially tied protectionism, technology controls, unilateralism as basically the same family as fascism, right? Because it's an exclusionary worldview. Their language, not mine.
Was that the Kaohsiung article?
Yeah.
Who's the head, the party secretary of CAS?
So anything they don't like is
right.
The same thing, the same thing that led to World War II. And of course, they're making a case to the outside world that because they were victors in the defeat of fascism, that their interests in the region deserve respect. And for China, of course, that's all about Taiwan. And so those things weren't surprising. But really, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this, Bill. The decision to have that imagery of Putin and Kim and Xi together, the three of them, it says something, which is that Xi Jinping has not wanted this narrative of authoritarian regimes and democracies to become too powerful. Like, he doesn't like it when people talk about the world in that particular way.
Well,
He
and
really
the way
liked
the Biden administration framed sort of democracies
yeah,
versus authoritarianism.
yeah, they call that, Cold War mentality, right? And so she has always said that what we are for is individual nations achieving modernization with their own characteristics, and that the Chinese case is a good example to show that that's possible, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when you have three authoritarian regimes standing together like that, it shows that the reputational costs of China being seen as a facilitator of what Russia and North Korea are doing, which is fighting a war against Ukraine. I'm sure the Europeans saw that, and they're going to take certain lessons from it. But apparently Xi Jinping has decided that two other things were more important. One was just showing that China is strong, that China will pursue relationships with whomever it wants, that China is not going to be separated from Russia and North Korea, that China is strong. And also, possibly, he decided that by treating Kim in this way and wooing him, it might have helped with, Beijing's influence in Pyongyang, as North Korea clearly has been closer to the Russians. But I think it's probably a judgment call that Trump respects strength, right? And so that is more useful than what will inevitably feed into this narrative of an axis of authoritarian regimes.
No, and it's hard to argue against that narrative with some of the imagery. I mean, again, it's just the whole, the Chinese have been railing against the Cold War mentalities, specifically talking about the U.S. for several years. I stayed up, watched the parade, watched Xi's speech, the whole thing. I mean, it's hard not to look at that and say, wow, that's just like the embodiment of Cold War mentality. And it is just it's very worrisome. It's very, frankly, it's just kind of depressing. To see sort of how, and you look at Putin, and Putin obviously thinks the collapse of the Soviet Union was one of the world's history's greatest tragedies. I think Xi Jinping thinks that too. The Kim dynasty has remained intact and is now more powerful than ever. In some ways, it's like the three countries that are, they want to bring back the struggles during the Cold War. In some ways, right? I mean, this is like the victory. They didn't actually lose; they just haven't won yet.
Putin said explicitly that during World War II, the Nazis were defeated but not annihilated, right? And Xi Jinping, what is self-revolution? Well, it means that the struggle never really ends.
Right.
There's no equilibrium. The equilibrium is the struggle, right? And really, the message too, like, it wasn't just being strong and united. What really also came out of the last few days is we're not going anywhere. And that was visible in the conversation that Putin and Xi had about feeling young, right?
Well, but also, the one caught on the hot mic about the organ transplants and biotechnology.
But also, just at 70, you're a young person, right?
Right.
And so Xi Jinping was born in 1953, so technically he's a young person according to that logic. And also by the end of the century, we'll have the ability to live to 150. So. And then the other thing that really jumped out at me, right, was you've read my book, so you know that in the 1980s, Xi Zhongxun had this really interesting role with foreign leftist, revolutionary, and communist parties, including the DPRK. And he was the one who went to Pyongyang to signify that they accepted the dynastic succession, right? And also when Kim Jong-il visited Beijing, he was hosted by Xi Zhongxun.
Right.
And I put up a picture of this. They went to see a show, and it was Peng Liyuan, even before Peng Liyuan was with Xi Jinping. So, it's like a family business, just as it is like a party business in a way. And so the fact that Kim Jong-un brought his daughter, I'm sure that the Chinese needed to clear with them the appropriateness of having that imagery of bringing the daughter. Now, I don't know if she's going to be the successor or not. It seems like a lot of analysts who follow this more closely than me think that she is, or whether it's just his way of looking more like a human being. But the fact that, first of all, he is so young, right?
Yeah.
So he's, almost certainly not going anywhere anytime soon, but already looking to the daughter. And so in a way, like the North Koreans solved this existential issue that the Russians and the Chinese never were able to, which is the succession, right? And so my book also in a way is a book about succession politics and how easily it blows up in the faces of Chinese leaders. Well, the North Koreans have an answer, right? And so, but the Chinese don't,
No,
which is kind of interesting to
and
think about.
The Russians don't. And on that topic, I mean, jumping out a little bit, but since you brought it up, how do you look at the succession around Xi Jinping? And is it something that, there's been reports recently, well, now, the 20 first party Congress should be in 2 years, right? 2027. Doesn't look like there's a successor now, but maybe someone will show up on the standing committee who looks more like that their potential successor. She is what, 73?
Mm-hmm.
Is he really worried about a successor right now, do you think?
So talking about succession is really hard for two reasons. One is he has no good choices. And second, contingency plays such a role in these decisions. So what do I mean when I say he has no good choices? Well, one thing that he could do is pick a successor. But if he does that, then he faces a whole host of challenges. One is, what if that successor doesn't do what he wants him to do? What if that successor doesn't consult with him enough? What if that successor is incompetent? What if that successor isn't tough? What if too many people think that the named successor is doing things that he doesn't want, even if it's true? What happens if the people aren't sure who to follow, right? The named successor or Xi Jinping. I mean, Xi Jinping unambiguously thinks that you need to have a core leader. So as soon as you have a prominent deputy, then people aren't going to be sure who to listen to, right? Even when it was clear that Xi Jinping was dominant under the earlier administration with Li Keqiang, people wondered whether Li Keqiang was doing his own thing. I don't think that was true, but it was probably consequential for him. And even now, people wonder whether there is any daylight between Li Qiang and Xi Jinping, right? And so if you pick a successor and the successor doesn't work out, you have to get rid of the successor, and that's very destabilizing.
Well, and Mao learned, and we saw that with Mao, right?
And Deng.
And yeah.
In fact, it happened to Deng. Deng was purged twice, even though he was totally loyal to Mao. So people used to think that maybe there was some, daylight between the two of them. There's a wonderful book that I really recommend your listeners and your readers to read. It's a biography of Peng Zhen that just came out in Taiwan, and it shows that the problem after the Great Leap Forward wasn't that you had people who were more practical trying to undermine Mao. It was that Mao was mercurial and he didn't tell people what he thought, and then they didn't guess right? So it's a big problem when you have that situation. And then, so the other situation, right, is that Xi Jinping doesn't pick a successor. But you probably want to decide who comes next, right? Because the whole source of meaning in his life is that he is shoring up the revolution and putting it onto a better trajectory. So presumably you want to make sure that the next person is someone who's going to do it right. So the people around him, how do you convince someone who has that worldview that you are the right person, right? And, people have also said, well, maybe he'll become like a father of the nation type role, like Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan. Well, it didn't really work that well for Nazarbayev, right? Because once you step away from the day-to-day decision making, you're suddenly vulnerable, right? And I think those problems are less prominent in a Leninist regime. But I mean, in a way, Xi Jinping's biggest triumph was ending old person politics, right? That you didn't have these senior comrades from behind the scenes intervening, like what Jiang Zemin had to face with Deng, or Hu Jintao had to face
You
with
must
Jiang
not
Zemin.
be watching all these YouTube channels that talk about how all the old retired cadres have come back and tried to facilitate a coup against Xi this summer.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
No, I mean, in all seriousness, I think one of the things that isn't fully appreciated is actually how, by design, Xi Jinping destroyed old person politics early on in his tenure, specifically to avoid this problem.
Yeah, you don't leave what was the expression? Don't leave the tea hot on the table or something? You probably remember better than me.
Yeah, no, the tea is cold and the people have gone, or people have left, I think, or something. No, and the reality too is all the folks who would actually have sort of the retired cadres who were senior enough to have command respect and potential influence, most of them have aged out. You look at who was on the rostrum at the parade, and I mean, Hu Jintao's not even there. Zhu Rongji's not there. They're just
Songping's
not
108.
right. I mean, Wen Jiabao is there. I mean, he's looking pretty old. I mean, they just were not. There's just no reason to believe that any of those folks have the ability to command any sort of influence or forces that would actually check Xi at this point, unlike previous era.
I mean, what kind of milieu did they grow up in? They grew up in the same milieu as Xi Jinping did, which is you put the party first, you put the leader of the party first, right? And so for them, those norms of deference are kind of a defining feature of the meaning of their lives, I think. And also, I'm not even so sure that they would be disappointed with what Xi Jinping is doing. Maybe some of them are, but my understanding is people like Hu Jintao, like he's doing what he wanted to do but could not, right? And so, no,
that is also. I mean, that is a great point, and it's one of the things where I think you get this. A lot of foreign analysts who are projecting what they think it should be, and so they might assume, oh, there must be all sorts of discontent at these former leaders. When actually, as long as they're not, them and their family members are able to do what they want to do, relatively speaking, maybe with a little more restraints than in previous eras. Why wouldn't they be happy with what they're seeing? I mean, China is much more powerful. China is much more rich. China's much richer. Yes, they have problems, but look at where they are. Look at their standing in the world. Look at the incredible improvement in material, the incredible material progress.
Yeah. But, also we should keep in mind, as I wrote about in my first book, that the party is not a popularity contest, right? I mean, think of the Machiavellian toolkit that Xi Jinping commands. I mean, just you and me brainstorming could probably go on for hours, right? He gets to decide when meetings are held, what's discussed at meetings, who goes to the meetings. He has a special relationship with the military and the political police who get to decide which version of the rules to enforce. The political police don't just have guns, they also have a lot of files. So he has the compromising material that he can use on whoever he wants to. You have a sense that there's nobody else, or if Xi Jinping went, the next person might be even more tough on you. And just this idea that if you go after the person who everybody has been saying is the legitimate leader of the party, then you push him out. That's very destabilizing, right?
And so, if you fail, it's you and your family, you're done.
Yeah, and if you go after that person in the middle of discontent, then what happens if you can't control the coup, right? What if people use that as an advantage against the party or something like that, right? So it's just very dangerous in so many different ways. So I think maybe we don't know. I mean, as you said, theoretically, we can come up with a lot of reasons for why people would like Xi Jinping. Maybe we can come up with reasons that they wouldn't. But, they say that the party is superior to Western democracies because it doesn't succumb to parliamentary populism, meaning that Xi Jinping can make decisions that other people don't like, and they can't do anything about it because it's the party's will.
Well, and the other thing too is, I mean, Xi Jinping is, again, when he came to power, I was living in Beijing, and you had sort of the Beijing chattering classes were talking about how he was never really smart. He was the dumb kid in school, yada, yada, yada. He's like, really? Well, okay, he outplayed everybody, right? And this was, 14 years ago, 13 years. And now look where he is, right? So he's clearly, at least from a political perspective, he's ruthless and brilliant. And so
he went to one school, the School of Hard Knocks,
right? I mean, the School of Struggle, right? And if you you look at what you were just talking about, and yes, certainly there are people who are unhappy, right? And I no doubt there are people higher up who are also unhappy, but he's not stupid, and so he's been building all these interlocking, lattice work of bureaucracies and control mechanisms to, I think, specifically ensure that any kind of discontent can't actually do what people talk about. Oh, there's going to be a coup, or there's going to be this, right? He is not unaware that this can happen. Both just because when you look at, I think, his mastery of history, the Communist Party history in China, but also I do wonder, did he learn anything from the Soviet Union? Did he learn anything from Stalin?
Absolutely, yeah. So there was this debate in China about why the Soviet Union collapsed, and there was one school of thought that said it collapsed because ideology became ossified, that they didn't care enough about rule of law and creating ways of understanding what people wanted and bringing it to them, that the competition with the West was too costly, that they were putting too many resources into the military industrial complex, and that they didn't institutionalize leadership politics within the Kremlin. That was one school of thought. And then there was another school of thought that said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was not inevitable, that the scientific triumphs of the Soviet Union were remarkable, that the problem wasn't that ideology was ossified, but that they didn't emphasize vigilance and struggle enough. And that ultimately the reason the Soviet Union collapsed was because of a successful case of peaceful evolution, which is that you win over key individuals to Western values, and then you wait for them to go into the leadership, and then they tear it down on their own. So this is a story of agency, not structure. And it's a story of being not vigilant enough against the West, and the dangers of pursuing political reform, and that because Gorbachev tried to save the Soviet Union, he essentially destroyed it. And so Xi Jinping obviously subscribes to the second view, right? And so what was very interesting is there was this documentary about the collapse of the Soviet Union that talked about the collapse of the Soviet Union in the way that I just described.
A Chinese
and it was
documentary.
clearly Chinese documentary. It was clearly a legitimation narrative for everything that Xi Jinping is doing, right? Focusing more on ideology, not trusting the West, not engaging in really fundamental structural political or economic reforms. And so for Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, this is kind of interesting, right? Like what this documentary made explicit was that they both came to power at a moment when centrifugal forces within their societies threatened to tear everything apart, and that the West was not paying enough respect to their interests in their region, but also sponsoring essentially those forces within those societies because they wanted them to undergo comprehensive Westernization.
And they weren't wrong. The West was doing that.
Well, when you read this guy Zhang Shigong, who's like one of the intellectuals who is very close to Xi Jinping, he says, actually peaceful evolution was working in China, that engagement was working in China because it was creating forces in society that were dangerous, and that Xi Jinping identified them, and that there was enough righteousness within the party, enough revolutionary legacy within the party, enough of the old school good stuff within the party that Xi Jinping could grab it and turn things around. That's the narrative that they say anyways, right? And it's a similar narrative in both Russia and China, that they turned the tide. And
right.
That's what they were signaling over the last couple of days as well in Beijing.
But it matters. It matters what the answer there is, because one of the things we hear, and certainly with the debate in the U.S. about U.S.-China policy, there is a school of thought that, well, U.S.-China relations are bad, but it's primarily because the U.S. has been too hard and too mean to China. I'm simplifying a little bit, and if only the U.S. were had softer policies, then everything would be much better. And I'm skeptical that's really true, given this totally different worldview that I think Xi Jinping has. And I believe that since he came to power. But, love to hear your thoughts on that.
So one of the central debates that we've had from the beginning of communism is this question of possibilityhood, right? So in the Soviet Union, you had conversations like, well, what if Bukharin had become the leader and not Stalin? And really, this is a question about how much ideological DNA can explain the trajectory of a society and regime, right? Like how much of what happened in Russia can be explained by reading Lenin, or even what is to be done by Chernyshevsky, right? Like, was there a dialectic? And as Ronald Sunni writes in one of his books, when you have Westerners who say that Stalinism was inevitable, they're making the same case that Stalin did, which was that Stalin was inevitable, right? And then you have other people who like to talk about contingency, right? There's sort of like a narrow contingency school where you say, well, this person could have just as easily been picked and it would have been a very different outcome. And I'm kind of like a middle position, right? Which is to say that you can learn a lot about these societies by thinking about Bolshevism, by thinking about Leninism, by thinking about communism. But I'm also not a determinist. And the reason I'm not a determinist is because there's something about the Leninist system that makes them inherently volatile. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, you keep having these cases over and over again of unintended consequences, right? Like the Cultural Revolution was a disaster and it led to reform and opening, right? And then Xi Jinping decided that reform and opening created all of these problems, so they're going to go in a whole other direction, right? But it's also volatile because you don't know who the successor is going to be. and neither do the leaders, right? I mean,
Mhm.
Andropov was the one who brought Gorbachev to the center, and Gorbachev did exactly the opposite of Andropov, I'm sure, would have wanted him to do. And we have the Politburo documents. There was no sign that Gorbachev was going to be Gorbachev. And people who knew Gorbachev think that Gorbachev didn't know he was going to be Gorbachev either, right? So people don't know who they're going to be until they're in a particular position. And so, we also have volatility within a particular era. So people say Deng was this pragmatist, ideology didn't matter as much anymore. Well, actually, there were a number of occasions where people thought Deng was going to start another cultural revolution, right? When they criticized the movie Bitter Love, when they tried to eliminate spiritual pollution, when they went after bourgeois liberalism in the wake of the fall of Hu Yaobang, the attacks on peaceful evolution after Tiananmen Square. So you still have leftism and radicalism even in the reform era, right? And so under Xi Jinping, it seems like some days he or other people go to Davos and talk about openness and friendliness, and you have smiling, and then you have snarling, right? And then you have people in China who are trying to figure out what's going on, and they're getting in trouble for it, right? And so it's not like they care about one more than the other. It's just that it's hard to function when you do care about both. And that's why it's so hard to predict, I think, the long-term trajectories of these societies, but also their short-term trajectories at the same time.
Yeah, and again, going back to this week and the Kim, Putin, Xi imagery. I mean, at this point, he's made his choice. It seems like it's just another. I mean, I think he made it long ago, but this was, I think, another pretty stark manifestation or stark illustration of that, which is worrisome. But no, I know somebody who went to the Communist Youth League college, university that Xi Jinping, as he was destroying the CYL influence, they renamed it, and then they like chiseled the name off. Every school has like a big rock in front with like the name. Somebody does the handwriting for the name. They chiseled the name off the rock just to sort of make the point. And I remember this person just swearing, like, if Li Keqiang had, the late Li Keqiang, the former premier, if he had become general secretary instead of Xi, we would have gone in a different direction. Maybe that's true, maybe not, maybe that's wishful thinking, but it is interesting, sort of related to the point you just made, right? This idea of different possibilities, but here we are. And so question for you, your book, is it in Chinese yet? It's no. No one in Taiwan has bought the rights to translate it?
There have been some initial conversations, but nothing formalized yet.
I'm shocked. I think it should. I would have expected to be translated for Taiwan at least. Hong Kong, I imagine, is hopeless at this point.
I hope it's translated in Taiwan. I'm enthusiastic about that possibility, but because it's not in stone yet, I'll refrain from.
Right. No, I understand. And have you gotten any feedback, reaction from Chinese scholars, the Chinese side? Have you any sense of how it's been received?
So, one of the most meaningful things about my book is talking to Chinese people about it, right? So, as I said, it's a complicated life, and people drew different lessons from it, even within his own family. So to hear how Chinese people, related to their own lives and what they know, and to the extent it's meaningful to them, that's been very interesting, right? And so I haven't been to China since let's see. 2019, I believe. But I will say this, right? Like, if anybody in China who wants to engage with me about the book, I'm very happy to do it, right? I didn't write the book with any particular agenda in mind, and I put history's interests first. Let me put it that way. So,
no, it's fascinating. I imagine it's probably a topic that lots of people want to read and are interested in, but really don't think it's a good idea to talk about for obvious reasons.
Well, I did give a talk at Jifeng, and there were a lot of people there.
The bookstore in DC, right?
Yeah, and so Chinese people are engaging with it, which makes me very happy because it's their history, right? And also, as you see in my book, it's in part a work of translation, right? I cite and rely very heavily on mainland scholars as well as other scholars in the region, because for people like you and me, Bill, if we don't, it gives us a sense of things, right, to talk to people who went through them, because I I believe that we're all humans and that there is the possibility for radical empathy, but at the same time, we should never underestimate how hard it is, and how important it is to take people seriously who are closer to these events.
So I know I'm cognizant of your time. You're heading off on a long-deserved 10-year sort of book tour, travel. I hope going
sabbatical,
to nice places, sabbatical, right? But I just want to say, what should I've asked you that I didn't, and what do you want the viewers, listeners to take away from your book and this really sort of monumental work that you've done over the last 9 or 10 years about Xi's father?
First of all, that's very kind. Thank you. You follow this so closely that you asked, I think, all of the questions that people are probably interested in. I would say that why do I do history? Maybe I'll conclude with that. And so when I was doing my PhD, I took a class with Roderick McFarquhar, and I was always struck by his insights. And there were people who had a closer understanding of specific issues than he did because they were watching it more closely on a day-to-day basis. But to the extent that history allows us to ask what makes sense and to give us a lens for interpreting, the few pieces of evidence that we do, that it's meaningful to look into the past to understand the present, but also that there's an intrinsic value to understanding these lives and saying what happened to them. And that's what I tried to do with my book. And if anybody wants to engage with me with their reactions, it's really fascinating for me to hear them. So thank you.
Well, thank you to Professor Torigian. Thank you. Get the book. I will put a link into it. It really, it's not a beach read. I tried to read it in Italy. I've sort of been working through it over the last few months. I found it's better to take it in chunks, but it is really just an amazing work of scholarship. And like I said at the beginning of the conversation, I just don't remember a China history book getting the kind of sort of broad exposure as this book did. And I think it's a testament to the work you put in. It's a testament to the topic, and of course, it's a testament to the importance of China and Xi Jinping. Okay, I do have one last question before I let you go. Death of Stalin, good movie, and if they did it for China, what would it be?
It's funny. So I teach a class on Chinese and Russian politics and foreign policy at the School of International Service at American University. And I always like to do a movie night with my students and get pizza and hang out a little bit outside of the classroom. And I ask them, what do you want to watch? So, sometimes I show them Still Yagi, which is a wonderful movie. It's a Russian movie. It's actually a musical that eerily reflects so many of the themes of my book that I always recommend it. But they said, have you seen Death of Stalin? And I said, no. And I was a little skeptical of it because I take history seriously. And I mean, this is a comedy.
Right.
And then we watched it anyways. And I was taking notes and I was like, wow, so many of the ideas that I think shape Leninist regimes emerge from this, right? I mean, right. I could be a pain and say, well, this conversation didn't happen, or this is not the way it went down. But thematically, it got a lot right? Like this idea that policy differences don't really matter all that much, except to the extent that people use alleged policy differences as weapons against each other, the use of compromising material, the role of the military and the political police, right. The way that they fake unity, even if unity isn't really there. And, they pretend to get along even when they don't get along, the way that so much of this happens, behind the scenes, but also just how dangerous this stuff is. And finally, this weird combination of ruthlessness and idealism that has been, part of the party since the beginning too.
Yeah, I think it is quite the movie if viewers or listeners haven't seen it. Well, look, thank you so much for your time. This has been a live discussion. It will go up as a recording on the Sinocism website, and then it'll also go out in the podcast feed over the next, probably later this afternoon. So thank you again. Have a really great weekend. And, love to talk to you again. I mean, this is one of those topics that I think is going to be with us for quite some time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Bill. And I really learned a lot from your thoughts today too. And I wish you a wonderful weekend as well. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.